Welcome to the Beau Show. Recently, I attended the National Conservatism Conference in Miami, a gathering of conservative minds to solve the challenges of leftism and secular progressivism. I met a man there by the name of Andrew Balio, who was an attendee, not a speaker, but we connected on the commonality of music. Andrew is the principal trumpet player in the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. At a conservative conference like this, meeting such a person would be a rarity, as conservatives do not embrace art the way that they could or they should. But Andrew has sought to preserve classical music in its purest form, not the modern modification that we have seen. I remember when I studied classical music at Northwestern University, as part of my degree, that we had to learn modern music by composers such as John Cage and Steve Reich. But it was always measured by its sonic quality, not by the possible oppression or race of the composer. That has changed. Even classical music has been distorted in favor of the plight of the composer rather than the merit of the music, as artistic directors embrace wokism. Musician to musician, I was able to take a deep dive with Andrew into why that has happened. He did not aim to become a conservative activist. He isn't even overtly political. Woke classical music thrust him into this space, much the way wokeism caused Dave Rubin to leave the Democrat Party. We were able to trade anecdotes of how we have encountered wokeism in our various artistic endeavors. I will admit, I was surprised to hear some of the stories that he told that have happened within his own artistic sphere. I didn't expect the classical world to have gone quite that far. You will hear a very cerebral discussion about how the intentional wokeism of music is going down the same path as the Cultural Revolution in China, where the goal is not musical excellence, but service of state or glorification of racial and class division. It is no longer a meritocracy or colorblind. You are now judged not by the content of your talent, but perhaps by the color of your skin. Minority first, talent second. It's important for you all to be aware of this because while fewer and fewer Americans go into the arts, they are becoming funneled into a one-dimensional field where you will no longer be adjudicated by your raw talent. You have to be programmed to a certain mindset before you pick up your instrument. That's not what artistic expression should be about. We've seen it in schools, we've seen it in corporations, we've seen it in Hollywood, we've seen it in sports, and now we see it in the arts. It's everywhere you turn. The judges or the arbiters of your artistic skill will want to know your pronouns, your vaccination status, what gender you identify with, knowing that how you look when you walk in will likely give you a slight edge. Have a careful listen to my conversation with Andrew Balio. I'm at the National Conservatism Conference in Miami, Florida, and my guest today is Andrew Balio. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me here at the conference.
Nice to see you.
Andrew, we have a lot of commonalities, especially from a musical background. So if you would, tell me a little bit about your musical background. You are a principal trumpet player at Baltimore Symphony, and you also have an organization as well. So please tell me about that.
Yes. As a result of my playing in symphony orchestras around the world, first I started, first my real beginnings were in Wisconsin, playing in the band, and then my first orchestra job was in Mexico, and then I went on to the Israel Philharmonic for about 10 years, and then the last 20 years have been with the Baltimore Symphony, and it really got me thinking that what the classical music world needed was some type of change agent, some organization to really support classical music in succeeding. Just really because classical music is under so many challenges because of, we have globalism and all these huge market changes, and everything's shifting all the time, and it's hard for us to keep up. Classical music's prospects, I found, were extremely bright, but we simply weren't grabbing the opportunities that were right under our noses. So,
do you think classical music is dying out as an art form as a whole?
No, but in certain areas it is waning. Interestingly, in Asia, in China and Korea, and actually the first right out of the gates after World War II was Japan. These three countries, they really took classical music on in a big way, and the great success story in classical music are our colleagues in China and Korea and Japan. And what they've done is they've really saved classical music in many ways, because as we often observe that the West is undergoing a crisis of identity, and they in these Asian countries, they have such tremendous confidence, not only in themselves, but in classical music. They have
discipline.
And yes, because classical music really hooks them because of their Confucian values. You have this tremendous overlap of Confucian values, of the valuing of hard work, meritocratic, and they're very strictly meritocratic measures. But it's an aesthetic, abstract endeavor.
Well, I'd like to get to China in a minute. I'll come to that in a couple of questions. But like you, I was classically trained, but I also studied political science actually as a minor, and I found myself at odds sometimes with some of my liberal professors, and at odds with them and debating them sometimes. Did you find that when you were studying music? Did you have that issue at all in your education?
Yes, this is the 80s for me, and already we saw the seeds of trying to flatten out the music world, trying to say that there are no hierarchies. There's no way of saying one thing is better than the other. So there was already that attempt, but it was still, the silos existed because they were natural hierarchies and just sort of family associations that the different groups of classic, the different music genres naturally clustered in. But what really bothered me when I moved back to the U.S., mid-career, was the overt and over politicization of classical music.
Interesting.
It's so unnecessary. Now, politics is not something that I'm really naturally interested in, but I got dragged.
You're forced to.
Yeah,
basically.
I got dragged, kicking and screaming into the, here I'm in a national conservatism conference where I don't want to be, but this is where we have conversations about at least preserving and sustaining things that are wonderful that were in our past. Not everything has to be torn down, with a wrecking ball.
Can you tell me how you saw the politicization in classical music, specifically what you saw that was a wake-up call to you?
Well, the first big extinction event for classical music was with modernist music, trying to impose it on audiences that really wanted to hear their Beethoven, their Brahms, Mahler, Strauss, anything tonal, anything listenable, anything that would have a melody in it, they basically could hook onto. And then, but then we had this obligation to play some piece of music that neither the musicians didn't like it. We would be laughing about, what is this thing we're playing? And then the audiences are suffering through it, and then we suffered at the box. So why did we have to do this? Which was a whole political thrust, as it turned out, as I learned in my studies.
Interesting.
And now the second wave of the whole thing is now woke new music. So the whole
activist music, perhaps.
Yes, activist
music with a cause.
Not necessarily, just the fact that it exists. Just the place, its very presence on the program is a political statement. And so that's the new. That's sort of, it's going to be our second extinction event right after COVID. Already it's hard enough to get people to come to a concert because they're afraid of being infected, and already it's a hard sell. And then on top of it, they were saying now you have to sit through something that may or may not be very listenable because they're arguing for the value of a piece of music on things that are not aesthetic, because there's only one reason to play a piece is for how it sounds. But now, of course, they have all these other reasons, if it could be from some minority group or it's a this or that.
Oppression.
It's something like that. There's some political, it boils down to a political argument for a piece of music, whereas the piece of music should be arguing for its own existence on by its own aesthetic merits. Well, and then we can talk about, the political interests of the composer, because all these composers had interesting, views, but that's not even secondary, it's tertiary to how the piece sounds.